Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Monday, September the 16th, 2024. Today there is an opposition aspect between Venus and Chiron, and this is what I want to talk about. And I'm going to look at examples of people who have this opposition in their charts. For example, Kamala Harris, who we've been talking about a lot, she has got an opposition between Venus and Chiron. And so did Mohamed Atta, who was leader of the attacks on the Twin Towers, the 9/11 events. Okay, I know some people think it wasn't him, but someone else was involved. Maybe it was a government agency, but certainly if we take the mainstream account, Mohamed Atta had a big involvement in the attacks. And yes, he had Venus opposition Chiron. And two people from Britain had Venus opposition Chiron. Magician Aleister Crowley had it, and so did Jimmy Savile. If you're not British, you may not have heard of Jimmy Savile, but he was a bit of a monster. He was a TV personality, and just after his death, it came out that he'd been abusing young women, often underage young women in their teens, and it was a major scandal, and I'm not sure if the BBC has quite recovered from it. Indeed, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, was blamed for not giving his file sufficient attention. I mean, I don't necessarily think it was his fault, but when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, there was a file about Jimmy Savile that was disregarded, and it happened under Keir Starmer's watch. His supporters say he had nothing to do with it. It wasn't his fault. But anyway, the cloud of Jimmy Savile in the UK persists. But before I talk about Venus opposition Chiron, I want to look at what's happening today astrologically and in terms of the I Ching. And just a reminder that if you like this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to really indicate that you liked it. And if you're not subscribed and you like the video, I'd be really, really happy if you were to subscribe. Anyway, let's look at what's happening today, which is Monday, September the 16th, 2024. So here's a chart set for noon, and so let's see what's going on, and you can see that noon set for New York. We have the moon in early Pisces. So today the moon moves from Aquarius into Pisces. In fact, London time, that movement takes place at 10:39 a.m. So if you're in Africa, Europe, Africa and Europe, then the moon will move into Pisces sometime during the first half of the day, probably. If you're in the Americas, then it's a moon in Pisces day through and through. If you're in Asia, Australia, New Zealand, then as the day progresses, the moon will move from Aquarius to Pisces. So that is a big difference. The moon is moving into a water sign, and moon in Pisces is a bit more, certainly a lot more emotional than moon in Aquarius. Pisces is ruled by Jupiter. Of course, Aquarius is ruled by Saturn, and so it may be easier to express our feelings, and at the same time we may respond emotionally more powerfully to the events around us, and we may also have a certain amount of emotional flexibility. And the moon, when it moves into Pisces, you can see that it moves into Pisces, and then fairly soon after that it makes a trine aspect to Mars. So moon trine Mars, it's quite a fortunate aspect. It allows us to assert ourselves, but it's also fairly emotional because the moon is in Pisces, Mars is in Cancer, and it is about self-assertion, but perhaps self-assertion in a fairly indirect way. The best acts of self-assertion are going to be done in a way that maybe it's a little bit devious, doing things behind the scenes, but we can be effective. Now, there is also a biquintile between Venus and Saturn, and I think this Venus-Saturn biquintile could be quite fortunate. Just a reminder, a biquintile is 144 degrees, which is 2/5 of a circle. And so Venus and Saturn are already in mutual reception by exaltation. So Venus is in Libra, which is the exaltation of Saturn, and Saturn is in Pisces, the exaltation of Venus. And so with this biquintile aspect, it's capable of being quite cool. We have strong feelings for sure, but in terms of relationships, we can manage them quite effectively. It's perhaps about having an idea about the way a relationship should work, what kind of structure we want that relationship to have, and perhaps what its outer form is. And so that might be our vision about how to relate, and maybe we can actually turn that vision into actual practice, into reality. Though, Venus is, as I always say, it's not just about relationships, it is about money and resources. And so perhaps with Venus biquintile Saturn, we might be able to marshal our resources, bring our resources together, create some structure there, and perhaps also create some self-discipline. So if there has been a sort of a hole in our bank account, for example, I don't know, money pouring out for a particular expense, or the expense might be unnecessary, the Venus biquintile Saturn might give us a chance to sort things out, perhaps to plug that hole. And we also have Venus opposition Chiron. Now, I'm going to be talking about that later in the video in some detail, but I think with Venus opposition Chiron, there may be a certain emphasis on our independence. Now, I understand that the moon has just gone out of Aquarius, and it's not so strong as it used to be in terms of that independence one associates with Aquarius. But then we have Venus opposition Chiron. I think we're still going to want our independence, and we're going to, I think, also perhaps be aware of our separateness. However much we engage with other people, we understand that we are still individuals, and at times we just may feel a certain sense of separation with that Venus opposition Saturn, and a feeling that we're different. Now, that may be a good thing or it may be a bad thing. It kind of depends. And I suppose some of us might feel a certain wound as far as relationships are concerned. If you take the view that Chiron is a wounded healer, Venus opposition Saturn, we may feel that we just can't get as close to certain people as we'd like to. But I will be talking at length about Venus opposition Chiron at the end of the video. Now, as far as fixed stars are concerned, I notice that Mercury is conjunct the fixed star Zosma, and it's a pretty minor fixed star, and I suspect that we can essentially ignore it. But as I notice that Mercury is conjunct Zosma, I suppose one might ask, what does it mean? So Reinhold Ebertin and Hoffman, in their fixed stars and their interpretation, they do talk about this star. They don't talk about it in great detail, but they say Zosma is Delta Leonis. That means, I suppose, it's the fourth brightest star in the constellation of Leo, and it's on the back of a lion, and it has a Venus-Saturn nature. Its reputation is that of having an alert mind, but also an inclination to melancholic moods. So that's one view of Zosma. Vivian Robeson, in his The Fixed Stars and Their Constellations, he also talks about Zosma, but like Ebertin and Hoffman, he doesn't go into great detail about what Zosma is about. In fact, it's the very last star he covers. And he says, it's from, by the way, Zosma, which apparently means a girdle. He says again, of the nature of Venus and Saturn, it causes benefit by disgrace, selfishness, egotism, immorality, meanness, melancholy, unhappiness of mind and fear of poison, and gives an unreasonable, shameless and egotistical nature. So we have to perhaps watch out with Zosma, and we might have some difficult thoughts there, Mercury conjunct Zosma. But as Ebertin says, it's an alert mind, but we don't want to perhaps think too much. I suppose Mercury in Virgo conjunct Zosma might think too much and might convince itself that things aren't great. But I don't want to emphasize Zosma too much. Now, in terms of what things would look like, say, if you were in Australia, very quickly, let me just change the coordinates to Sydney, Australia, just to give us a slightly different view. So this is today from the perspective of Sydney, Australia. You can see that when I was doing the New York chart at noon, the moon was at 3 degrees Pisces. So if you're in Australia, the moon is at 25 Aquarius at noon. So it's very much still a moon in Aquarius day. And probably the dominant aspect, if you are in Australia, at least the dominant lunar aspect, is going to be moon square Uranus. You know, I talked about moon trine Mars when I looked at this chart from a New York perspective. But even from a European and, say, African perspective. But if you're in Australia, moon square Uranus does indicate that today might be a little bit unstable. Moon square Uranus in fixed signs, things could be difficult in the sense that some people are going to be stubborn and they're not going to want to change, and they're going to believe that their views are the right views, and they might really want to hold on to those views through thick and thin. And also, I suppose, moon square Uranus, there could be sort of eruptions maybe. But with moon in Aquarius, there is this emphasis on independence if you're in Australia or New Zealand or East Asia. So that's the Australian picture. And it's a moon that matters because the moon does move quickly, and it does seem that the picture in Australia is very different, or somewhat different, than if you're in New York. But still, Venus biquintiles Saturn, wherever you are, and also Venus opposition Chiron. So let me just turn back to the New York chart. I should have set that up already, but I'm sorry about that. Okay, so now I want to just quickly look at the heliocentric picture. So I set up the I'm going to set up the heliocentric chart. So this looks at the positions of the planets from the viewpoint of the Sun, if you put the Sun at the center of the solar system. And from a heliocentric viewpoint, probably the main aspect is an opposition between Mercury and Pluto. So Mercury-Pluto opposition can be about propaganda. It's about how we express our message, and we want to influence people with Mercury opposition Pluto. But Mercury opposition Pluto might indicate that we are being vulnerable to other people's influence. Who is influencing who? Who is trying to manipulate? Who is being manipulated? So these are the questions one might ask with Mercury opposition Pluto. And I think we're going to be very aware at the messages we are being given, whether it's in social media, what our friends are saying, what our governments are saying, what companies are saying. And it's all a bit of a struggle. And So some of us may be grappling with information and how to deal with it. I mean, for example, in my last video, I talked about Springfield, Ohio, and Donald Trump's statement that immigrants had been eating cats and dogs. Now, clearly, that is a very controversial statement. And looking at the comments to my video, I mean, some people accuse me of being naive because I was a little bit skeptical about it. Other people were thinking that it's just rumor and hearsay. So that perhaps is what Mercury and Pluto is all about. It's about information that is important, but is it true? That might be the question. How is that information being constructed? What is the spin on that information? And it might be important. So when you look at the information you're being told, for example, about the presidential election, about who's leading who in the opinion polls, it's kind of incredible. If you look at videos coming from a right-wing perspective, and apparently Trump has actually got a lead and he's going to win. And if you look at it from a sort of mainstream perspective, Kamala Harris, she sorted everything out in the debate and everything's good. Depends what you want to look at. And with Mercury opposition Pluto, there is that conflict there. And of course, it's what people do, don't they? If they believe something, they will choose the news items which confirm it. They're not going to watch things which tell them what they don't want to believe. And I think that is how Mercury opposition Pluto could be working. And that Mercury opposition Pluto, does have a positive side, because Venus is sextile Pluto heliocentrically, and Venus is also trine Mercury heliocentrically. So if you are a propagandist, or if you are someone who is trying to deliver a message, that Venus perhaps suggests that there is a right way to deliver that message. You've got to consider other people and their sensibilities, and if you get it right, you can get people to believe what you're saying. So that's perhaps the thing we need to concentrate on from a heliocentric view. Mercury opposition Pluto, Mercury trine Venus, and Venus sextile Pluto. And that Venus sextile Pluto, that's also quite nice. That's very persuasive. We know how to get people onto our side. Okay, so now let me look at the forecast for the 12 signs. So these are my forecast for the 12 signs for today, which is Monday, September the 16th, 2024. Aries. Aries, you can feel that things are changing, that the moon is now moving into Pisces. And with the moon moving into Pisces, I think to an extent you are slowing down. You feel that you don't have to be in a hurry to get things done. You can kind of do things your way, at your own pace, and things don't have to be such a rush. And at the same time, you are going to be in control, because the moon in Pisces, it does make a trine to Mars. And so with the moon in Pisces, trine Mars, you're going to have a fair amount of energy at your disposal, and it needs to be focused on things that you are entirely comfortable with. You don't want to be out there on unfamiliar territory, trying to create something brand new. That's not really what it's about. It's perhaps focusing on things that are important to you, and that might mean like your home and your family, or things that require subtlety. Now, Aries can be a sign that isn't particularly subtle. You like to say it as it is, but there is always a place for subtlety, for doing things in perhaps sort of quite a secretive way. And that's, I think, something you can do quite effectively. And So if you've got battles to face, if you feel that now is perhaps a time for some kind of conflict, then it has to be done on your terms, and it has to be done indirectly. If you want to knock down the castles, you don't sort of, or if you want to capture the castle, you don't smash your way through the main gate. You have to sort of undermine the foundations of things, do it slowly, dig tunnels, and that's really is the best way, I think, to make progress. Now, as far as other people are concerned, they are arguably in quite a strong position, and that perhaps that is a good reason why you need to be subtle. If you confront people head on, I'm not convinced you're going to be the winner. There might be a little bit of bluster on your part, but ultimately I don't think it's going to work. Instead, you have to accept people's strengths and try to understand people's weaknesses. On the face of it, people do not have weaknesses. They're coming up with quite a strong front. But, we shouldn't forget that Venus is opposition Chiron. So if you connect Venus with other people, then particularly on a one-to-one level, partners, for example, enemies, rivals, Venus opposition Chiron, there is a weakness. There is a kind of an Achilles heel. Now, that might be an Achilles heel or a weakness that you can help someone with. So if someone's got a problem, something bothering them, then you can do some healing. On the other hand, if you're trying to take someone on and get the better of someone, you need to find their weakness. And it may not be immediately apparent, but if you look hard enough, I think you will find it. Though it shouldn't really be a day of one person winning, another person losing. It really needn't be like that. I mean, and certainly you're not in the mood for huge conflicts, taking people on directly. That's just not going to work. Taurus. Today, Taurus, Venus is opposition Chiron, and I think this aspect could be quite powerful, and I think it does have an impact on you. So there are a number of ways in which Venus opposition Chiron could work. With Venus opposition Chiron, you might feel that you are in some way separate, that you have your own ways of doing things, you have your own attitude and approach, and it's just simply not the same as other people's approach. You are different, and there are a few ways in which this could manifest. It might be about you being the rebel, because there is something rebellious about Chiron. So Venus opposition Chiron, you want to do things differently, and you are not going to be told. So that is a possibility. But with Venus opposition Chiron, it might be, Taurus, that you also believe that you're somehow alone, that you're doing things in your own way, and that you can't really count on other people for help and support. And some things do have to be done on your own because you're the only person that can sort it out. And you may not be entirely happy about the situation, but it is perhaps a reality, and when you do things on your own, I do think that you can be pretty successful about it. Though Venus opposition Chiron isn't the only thing going on today. The moon is now moving into Pisces, and with the moon moving into Pisces, that does indicate that you're feeling quite energized, and you feel that you can make things happen. And the moon does make a trine to Mars. And so it may be that if you feel yourself perhaps to be alone or to be estranged from the rest of the world, it does seem you can actually do something about it with that moon trine Mars. It may be about saying something or showing someone another side to your personality, or perhaps showing someone a little bit of sensitivity. And a little bit of sensitivity on your part could make a big difference. And I think that moon trine Mars may, through your words perhaps, create a connection between yourself and another person. Or moon trine Mars might be about you deciding to visit someone. You know, it's a short visit. It's nothing huge, nothing that takes a lot of time. But that visit could make all the difference. So if you do feel isolated, I don't think it's a permanent state, and I actually think that it's a state that you can actually do something about. And perhaps the wound of Chiron, with Venus opposition Chiron, can transition into Chiron the rebel, Chiron the maverick, Chiron who is challenging not just yourself, but is challenging everyone you meet. You do have new ideas, you do have interesting ideas. Now, if you are in Australia or New Zealand, it's a slightly different picture. Sure, the Venus opposition Chiron is still there, but the moon is in Aquarius. Moon is going to be in Aquarius all day. And so moon in Aquarius will be making a square to Uranus. And so for those of you in East Asia, Australia, New Zealand, moon square Chiron is the operative aspect, not moon trine Mars. And so Uranus is in Taurus, your sign. The moon is in Aquarius, and so they make a square. And I actually think it's quite fortunate. I think that you are very rebellious and you want things done your way, and you're not going to compromise. And now that could cause trouble, but perhaps through your strength of personality, you can really make things happen, and perhaps it pays to be stubborn. But you do have to look at the situation. So just a reminder that the Australian and New Zealand experience of today could be just very different from how those of us in Europe and Africa and America feel the day's energies. And really, Taurus, that's pretty much it. Though, one other thing, Venus is biquintile Saturn, and I think that is a very nice aspect for you. Venus biquintile Saturn, it's about what you try to create, and with this biquintile, I think that however rebellious you feel, however much of a maverick you feel, even however wounded you feel, with Venus biquintile Saturn, you're able to create some kind of structure which other people might be involved in. So you can perhaps control your social environment, and if people have not been clear, you can force them to be clear, and with effort you can make good progress in terms of the various relationships in your life. And perhaps what you have to do, and I said this in a general sense when I was talking to everyone, but I think it's very specific to Taurus, is that you perhaps have to have an idea about how relationships should be working, because quintiles and biquintiles, they are about that inner will, and actually making that inner will actually happen in terms of a real world out there. Yeah, we can make things happen. And so if you have an idea about the way relationships should be, then that idea can become a reality if you make the effort. Gemini. So Gemini, we've got the moon moving into Pisces. Okay, it may not be today that the moon moves into Pisces. It could be tomorrow, but the moon is moving into Pisces. And with the moon moving into Pisces, I think that you are becoming somewhat ambitious. I think that you have a sense of what you want and what you'd like to achieve today. So if you come into the day with a set of ambitions, then it is a time to actually work out how to realize those ambitions. And you will have a lot of energy at your disposal, because the moon, as it moves into Pisces, will make a trine aspect to Mars. Now, of course, if you're in Australia or New Zealand, that's going to be something you're going to be experiencing more tomorrow, but you're not going to miss out on it. It's just going to happen a little bit later. So with moon trine Mars, you have, I think, a strong sense of your own priorities, that there are things you definitely want to do. You have an idea about how you want to do them, and I think you're going to be able to look after yourself, and you could look after yourself by certainly being assertive. I'm not saying you actually have to be aggressive about it, but you need to sort of clearly state what you want. And some of these desires and ambitions might relate to money. I wouldn't underestimate the importance of money today, although I understand it does depend on your situation. But if you want to push a financial point today, for whatever reason, I think you're going to be able to do a really good job of it. And you just need to be very focused about what you want to achieve financially. And if someone is being difficult with a financial issue, then I think that your persistent approach is going to pay you handsome dividends. But persistent, yes, but not necessarily stubborn and single focus. You've got to be a Gemini, and also with the moon in Pisces, you've got to perhaps try this approach, that approach, say things in one way, say things in another way, come up with different arguments, and perhaps address the situation in a slightly sideways approach, and perhaps confuse the other party a little. But in the end, I think if you're persistent, then I think that from a financial perspective, I think you can make good progress, and I think your desires and your aims will be very clear. Now, in the introduction to the planetary picture for today, I mentioned the fact that Mercury was conjunct Zosma. Now, Zosma is perhaps a rather obscure fixed star, the fourth brightest star in the constellation of Leo. But when we listen to what Eberton and Robeson were saying about Zosma, there is a sense in which Zosma does have a sharp mind. Of course, Gemini does have a very sharp mind, but particularly when Mercury, which is your ruler, is in Virgo. Virgo is a great place for Gemini to be in. I mean, Mercury's in its own sign, and it's also exalted. See, with Geminis and Mercury is the one planet that has rulership and exaltation in the same sign of Virgo. But with Mercury and Virgo conjunct Zosma, yeah, you've got a good mind, but maybe you're going to think too much, and perhaps you might sort of persuade yourself that things aren't as good as they seem. So you can sort of think yourself into a situation of despondency. Just a reminder, I've got my sun in Gemini, so I'm talking to myself just as much as I'm talking to you. And there is just a warning of just overthinking it. And we should not forget that Mercury is starting to make an opposition to Saturn. Okay, it's not there yet, but I think we're starting to feel that Mercury opposition Saturn, and that Mercury opposition Saturn could undermine our confidence, and it might make us perhaps a little more negative than usual. And another thing to talk about in terms of Mercury is the heliocentric picture. So when I looked at the heliocentric picture, Gemini, I noticed that Mercury was opposition Pluto. Just a reminder, I'm talking about the heliocentric position, not the geocentric position, but heliocentrically, Mercury is opposition Pluto. And with that heliocentric opposition, yes, there may be a temptation to think too much, to think about one thing to the exclusion of all else. And you think about it so much that you can't think about anything else, and it just becomes almost a point of obsession. And actually, Geminis can be obsessed. That is a Gemini trait. You know, they think about lots and lots of things. And then one thing crops up and they can't stop thinking about it. It gets them. You know, maybe that's like, you know, Donald Trump. I think he has that. Obviously, his mind is going all over the place, but suddenly something he gets obsessed about something and he keeps coming back to it. And yeah, perhaps we saw that in the debate. You know, I suppose how Geminis can perhaps be baited. You talk about things that are important to a Gemini, like how many people are coming to their rallies, or maybe their business acumen. Geminis don't like to be undermined like that. You know what the worst thing you can possibly say to a Gemini is? Tell them they're boring. That's my dread. You know, actually, in terms of these videos, you know, I do sometimes get negative comments. Of course, I mean, that's reasonable. Sometimes I deserve negative comments. But the one comment that I'm absolutely terrified of getting is someone saying, you're just repeating yourself. You're using the same phrases. You're using this. You know, you're using the same theme day in, day out, and that's not what I want to hear. Any indication that I'm boring, I'm speaking as a Gemini. It's just something that I just would not be able to handle, and I would try to address the problem. So yeah, Geminis do have these obsessive points, and they don't like to. They can take criticism about many things, but there are certain key areas of the Gemini life which they take really seriously, as I think we saw with Donald Trump and his debate. Remember, he's a Gemini, crowd sizes, business acumen. You get at that, and you know, you get under his skin, as they say. So with this Mercury opposition Pluto Gemini, I think it's just important that you don't get too obsessed, and you find a way of breaking out of any cycle of obsession. Remember, heliocentric Venus opposition Pluto, and there is a trine heliocentrically between Venus and Mercury, and a sextile between Venus and Pluto. So that trine may actually represent the way out. And so perhaps, Gemini, if we do find ourselves being a little too obsessive, perhaps we need to talk to another person about it. Get a different view. And a different view really could make all the difference. So that's broadly what the day is about. And also, Gemini, it's just very important to be completely sane today. You know, sure, you have a sharp mind, but however sharp you are, there may be moments today where you perhaps get so focused on something that you actually lose touch with reality. It may not last so very long, but there'll just be moments where you almost forget where you are. And then you have to come down to earth very quickly. And so do look at what's going on around you. You know, don't be so focused on yourself and what bothers you that, yeah, you lose touch with reality. And perhaps that's why it's important that you have some engagement with other people. I think it does matter, because I think will help ground you. Cancer. So Cancer, the moon is moving from Aquarius to Pisces, and it's a kind of bit of an annoying situation, because part of the day is going to be in Aquarius, part of the day is going to be in Pisces, and it does depend where you are. Now, sure, if you are an American Cancerian, then it's a moon in Pisces day. Moon is going to be in Pisces all day, and that's what matters. I think if you're in Europe and Africa, then certainly for the last half of the day, that's where the moon is going to be. So that's easy. Now, if you're an Australian Cancer or a Cancerian from New Zealand, then really it's a moon in Aquarius day. So Cancerians in Australasia are going to have perhaps a very different day from Cancerians in Europe and the Americas. So very quickly, if you are in Australia or New Zealand, the moon is in Aquarius, square Uranus in Taurus, and so there may be a sense of disruption, that you might want to do things, you might have a clear idea about how you want to do them, but you're very aware also of what could go wrong, and there's a certain danger that you're perhaps a little too stubborn, and you get so focused on something that you lose sense of what you're doing and whether it's actually worth putting in so much effort. Now, if you're in the Americas, in Europe, it's a slightly different picture. The moon is in Pisces, not Aquarius. I mean, that's the dominant thing. Moon moving into Pisces, and so moon moving from Aquarius to Pisces. It's quite an important change. So if you're in Australia, by the way, the moon will of course move into Pisces sort of late in the day, and certainly into tomorrow. So it will happen to you in the end. But with the moon moving into Pisces, I think that you become more open-minded and probably less focused on yourself and your immediate concerns, and you perhaps realize that there's a world out there that needs to be discovered. And when the moon moves into Pisces, it makes a trine with Mars in Cancer, and I think that's a very nice trine. It's a trine that allows you to assert yourself, but in an open-minded kind of way. You're interested in what's going on in the world around you, and you perhaps feel that you want to do some exploring. That doesn't necessarily mean physical exploring, that you have to go down the Amazon or anything like that. No, it's just discovering what the world around you is really like, and perhaps being open to new viewpoints and new experiences. And so Moon trine Mars is about that. But with Moon trine Mars, there's no doubt that you can look after yourself, and you can look after yourself on all levels. And you're talking about exploration. For some Cancerians, the spiritual side of things could actually be quite important, and it may be that you want to put some effort into spiritual pursuits. And we've got in a way we've got a spiritually busy week ahead. We've got a partial eclipse coming up in a couple of days, and then right at the end of the week we've got the autumnal equinox, which is an event of great significance, especially on a spiritual level. I'm hoping to put a video out on the spring equinox, the autumnal equinox, at least autumnal from the perspective of the Northern Hemisphere. I'm hoping to put a video out on that very soon. But wherever you want to put your energy, I think you can do it very successfully. You don't have to make a big effort to be seen and heard. I think that people will understand you. They will be able to see you without you having to make a big fuss about it. And use your feelings and your sensitivities, because your sensitivities are on good form at the moment. And so if you're having to deal with people, I think you're going to have a good understanding of where their weaknesses lie, where their strengths are, and how best to get what you want from them. And so, overall, Cancer, I think it's a day that looks good. I think that you will get your way. Now, there are different ways of getting your way. If you're in the Americas or Europe, you get your way through Moon trine Mars, being quietly assertive. If you're in Australia and New Zealand, you get your way through Moon square Uranus. You cause perhaps a little bit of an upset, a bit of a drama, but as a result of that drama, the focus is on you, and you get your way. So it doesn't really matter where you are. I think it's a day, Cancer, regardless of your time zone, where I think you can be very effective and powerful. Leo, you are starting, I think, to change gear a little. And, this is because the moon is moving into Pisces. Okay, even if you're in Australia, where the moon doesn't move into Pisces until the end of the day, there's still this sense that something is coming to an end, and that you do need to change the way you're dealing with the world. And I would have said it's perhaps about backing off a little, not being totally focused on the challenges in the real world that have to be fought about, having to deal with things in the here and now, having to engage with real people. I'm not convinced that's really what it's about. I think, Leo, there's a fair amount of work to be done on your own. And I think that that's where the action is. You are, I think, taking things pretty seriously, certainly more seriously than you were yesterday. And your emotions they're just stronger than usual. You're more sensitive than usual. You're picking up things more than usual. And if you were to be in a very high profile situation, or if you were to be surrounded by people, then, Leo, there's a possibility that you might just feel overwhelmed. But if you respect the situation, and perhaps that means also understanding your own weaknesses, if you can do that, then you can take the necessary measures. And I think that giving yourself a fairly high amount of protection is going to be important. I mean, I'm really talking about psychic protection, protecting yourself from the emotional garbage that could be thrown at you from the outside world. So you don't have to expose yourself to that kind of danger. It's not danger, but it's just something that could be undermining. So, that is just a reminder, Leo, that you do need to look after yourself. Yet, I don't think that you need to completely batten down all the hatches. I don't think it's quite like that. I think, Leo, that you're able to, I think, communicate very well, actually. But it's got to be on your terms. Always got to be on your terms. It's about choosing who you talk to. It's even about choosing what you talk about. And that way you can remain in control. And some people could be really good for you. They're on your wavelength. And so you need to perhaps seek those people out, but without making too much of an effort. It's not about you having to go beyond your boundaries. That's not something you have to do. You can kind of stay put, and from a social perspective, you see who's available, see what's available. But whatever happens in terms of your social life, in terms of relationships, it does have to be done on your level, on your terms. And I think if you remember that, then you're going to be fine. Virgo, I suppose I have to say that Mercury, your ruler, is conjunct Zosma, but Zosma is a somewhat obscure fixed star, and it may mean nothing, but with Mercury conjunct Zosma, there is a possibility that I think you overanalyze things. So Mercury conjunct Zosma, I think it gives you a sharp mind, and we know your mind is sharp at the moment because Mercury is moving through Virgo, your sign. But then hitting Zosma, you just could have too much of a good thing here. Your mind may be so good that maybe it asks one question too many. And if you ask one question too many, then that might feel difficult. You might find that you are actually undermining yourself. Perhaps because you've brought up a worry that you didn't really have to deal with, but actually you are dealing with it. And matters are made perhaps more difficult by the fact that Mercury is starting to make an opposition to Saturn. And this opposition to Saturn, it's not exact today, but it will be exact in a few days' time. And you're starting to feel its influence. And Mercury opposition Saturn may give you a certain sense of negativity, that you're having your doubts and you're wondering whether things are really going to be okay. And perhaps the more you think about it, the more you feel concerned about it. And this is emphasized also by the fact that from a heliocentric view, Mercury is opposition Pluto. I mean, I know geocentrically Mercury is not opposition Pluto, but heliocentrically it is. And with this Mercury opposition Pluto, we get a similar picture. We get the idea of Virgo asking itself, or you're asking yourself, deep questions. And it's kind of nice to be asking deep questions, but sometimes these questions cannot be too helpful, because they might encourage you to worry about things too much. But I mean, I don't want to create any self-fulfilling prophecies. I don't want to be the source of you starting to ask too many questions. I'm not inviting you to ask too many questions. I think perhaps what you have to do today is focus on the positives. And I think that the positives are that the moon is moving into Pisces. Okay, the moon may move into Pisces very late if you're in Australia or New Zealand, but in the end it gets there. And with moon moving into Pisces, I think it is a certain relief. I think that things are less onerous. There's perhaps less hard work. Perhaps you're just a little less focused on annoying little details. And you can also perhaps be distracted by other people. And maybe that's what you need at the moment. If you spend all your time alone, then that's just encouraging you to have obsessive thoughts. But if you're with other people, you can start to see a different view, and you can start to listen to what other people have to say. You may not really care what other people have to say, but it's a distraction. And with the moon making a trine to Mars, moon is in Pisces, Mars is in Cancer, I think that trine, again, it creates energy, but it creates energy which is not just focused on you and your problems. It's perhaps about maybe other people and their problems. And once you talk to people, you listen to what they've got to say, and then you start to realize that nothing is entirely perfect in their world, and perhaps you can listen to what they have to say, and that may be a distraction. And I think that's true for today. I think you do need distractions. You do not want to be in a situation where there is a single point of focus today, because if there were to be a single point of focus, then I think that could almost drive you crazy. And, going back to the heliocentric picture, I said that Mercury is opposition Pluto, but Mercury is also trine Venus. And that's very nice from the perspective of other people. So other people can be a real bonus in your life, and they can prevent you from tying yourself up in knots. So I think that is, broadly speaking, how you should handle today. Use your mind. You've got a good mind, but if you are going to use your mind, make sure that there are several points of focus, and that there are people around, if possible. Even if there are not people physically around, you've presumably got a phone. You can talk to people, have a conversation with people. Just a conversation, particularly a conversation about another person's problems which have nothing to do with you, could just make you feel a lot better, especially as today we've got Venus opposition Chiron. And with Venus opposition Chiron, I think that you could become aware of what's bothering people, particularly when it comes to money, but there may be other things bothering people. Money is not the only thing. So I think it's pretty clear how you need to handle the day's challenges. Just don't spend too much time alone, and you don't want to have single points of obsessive focus. Libra. Today, Venus is opposition Chiron. So you've got Venus at around 22 Libra, and Chiron also at 22 Aries. So they are opposition each other, and they're opposition each other across the main axis of your chart. So what does this mean? I think it could be something of a challenge for you. You might feel that perhaps you want to do things differently, or at least there's pressure to do things differently. And that could be because Chiron is about the maverick. It can be about the maverick, and you perhaps are aware of your separateness and that you are different from other people. And I know Librans are not supposed to think like that. Librans regard harmony as being important, getting the balance right, that's important. But you are an individual, and I think that Venus opposition Chiron does remind you of that you and other people are not the same. You have your particular view of the world, which is very special to you. And if anyone discounts it, thinks that you're just going to follow the crowd, they would be wrong. And Libra, there may be times when you do need to assert yourself, when you need to tell the world that actually you are different. And maybe with Venus opposition Chiron, this is something that you absolutely have to do. Now that's one approach to Venus opposition Chiron. I mean, Chiron is often seen as the wounded healer. I mean, it's coming a bit of a cliche, the wounded healer, isn't it? So I'm sorry not to have said things in a more sort of interesting way. Wounded healer. Maybe we have to get away from this. But what is that wound? Is there a wound with Venus opposition Chiron? If there is a wound, where would it lie? I suppose that wound might lie with other people and how people treat you. That is possible. And it may occur to you that actually some people are taking you for granted. And perhaps they've taken you for granted for a very long time. And then perhaps we start to see the connection between the wounded healer and the maverick. If you are being taken for granted, if your individuality is not being fully appreciated, then what do? Well, you have to show the world that you are different, that you have a unique way of doing things, and people better respect you, or else. So that might be how Venus opposition Chiron is working, and I think it should be positive. It allows you to be different and to understand what makes you different. And it may be a little bit painful and stressful to show how different you are, but maybe that's just something that you have to do. So that is an important theme for today. And as far as people are concerned, and some people are good for you, some people are bad for you, you have an opportunity at the same time to organize things and organize people. You may not feel that you have that ability, but I think you certainly have the desire, because Venus is biquintile Saturn. Venus is 144 degrees from Saturn, so this is about your vision, how you'd like things to be. So with Venus biquintile Saturn, you're thinking about the kind of structures you'd like to have in your social life, how you'd like to be able to use your time, to what extent you want to be independent, where you want to share things with people, all that kind of thing. You do have an idea about how you'd like things to be. And I think with Venus biquintile Saturn, I think that you can actually express this vision. And if you want to change your social world, then with this Venus biquintile Saturn, I think that is actually something that you are actually going to be able to do. And you should not underestimate your assertiveness, because the moon is making a trine to Mars, and I think that your vision of the way things should be organized is something that you can express very powerfully. I think people will listen to you. I think that, generally speaking, people will do what they're told. And so I think today you can get your feelings across, and I think that people will listen and they will respect you. But you perhaps have to have the courage to actually tell the world what you want. Because if you don't tell the world what you want, if you don't express your vision, then nothing much can happen. So, be open about how things should be structured and organized. And once you're open, I think things will start moving your way. And I think this especially applies if you happen to be working today or doing anything to do with business. And it will, your organizational abilities will be very clear, and I think people will understand and appreciate them. And you shouldn't be afraid of doing things differently with Venus opposition Chiron. You might want to change some pre-existing structures, things that people may have taken for granted, maybe for just for years it's been going on in the same old way, but you want to change it. And if you want to create that change, then I think that is definitely something that you're going to be able to do. Scorpio, I'm quite optimistic about today. Things do seem to be moving, and the reason they're moving is because the moon is making a trine to Mars. Okay, this trine to Mars may be more of a feature if you're in America, Africa and Europe, but if you're in Australia or New Zealand, then the moon trine Mars may be more about tomorrow, but it's going to come your way eventually. And so with moon trine Mars, Scorpio, this trine does have a direct impact on your sign, on Scorpio, because Mars is in Cancer, the moon is in Pisces, water signs, and Scorpio is a water sign. And so I feel, Scorpio, that there is movement, and it's good to have movement, because I think over the last couple of days, perhaps over the weekend, you may have felt that things were getting a little bit stuck. There were blockages. You may have felt that you weren't fully able to express yourself, that the circumstances weren't right. But with moon square Mars, then you can actually start to take action and really get things moving, and I think it'll be done in quite a smooth way. I think people will just do things your way without much fuss. Now, if you are in Australia or New Zealand, similar message, but not an identical message, because if you're in Australia and New Zealand, the main aspect is not Moon trine Mars, it's actually Moon square Uranus. Moon square Uranus is about getting your way, like Moon trine Mars, but it's more dramatic. It's not so gradual. It may be that you have to force things, and I think that you might be aware that someone or something is holding you up, and there might be more of a battle, more of a fight there, sort of more of a clash. So there is a certain difference of emphasis, whether you're in Europe, Americas, or if you're in Australia or New Zealand. But overall, Scorpio, you can get things to move, and as the day progresses, I think that you're going to feel a growing sense of your own power and agency, and that you can do things that you like doing. You don't have to do things that are tedious. You don't have to do things because you're being told to do them. You're doing things just out of the pure joy of it, and that's what you should be focusing on. Doing something that just feels right and makes you feel whole, and so that should be something, I think, very helpful for you. And so don't be negative. The universe wants you to make things happen, and at the same time we've got to consider, I suppose we've got to give some consideration to other people, and other people should not be underestimated. Remember, from a Scorpio view, Venus is ruler of Taurus, your opposite sign, and right now Venus is really, really strong, because Venus is in its own sign. It's in mutual reception with exaltation with Saturn, and Venus is actually still making a trine to Jupiter. So that indicates that in terms of the power equation over the week, the other person, the other party, possibly holds most of the cards. And so do bear that in mind. You can be as assertive and forceful as you like, but just remember, there is another person on the other end. On the other end of that particular line of communication, and that other person may be in a very strong position. So if you're thinking about things in terms of defeat, you winning, someone else losing, I wouldn't recommend it, because particularly if it's something very personal. Another person, you and this other person are in a conflict situation. Who's going to win? Who's going to lose? This week, I'm not convinced you're going to win. If anything, I'm afraid the other person might win. Next week, completely different matter. Remember, at the end of the week, Venus moves into Scorpio, and what happens is that the position of Venus just completely collapses. And of course, Venus will be moving into your sign. And so the tables will, I think, definitely turn. But in terms of rivalry, don't push it. It's not a time for battles or for head-on conflicts, because I'm not convinced that they will work in your favour. Instead, perhaps you should take the time to understand people. I think you can understand people. I think you can understand people's weaknesses, and as well as people's strengths, and that could be useful at a later stage. But right now, I would leave it alone. And I think that the main thing today is to be assertive, for sure, but not to be assertive in terms of being in a conflict with another person. It's just instead about you just being very clear about what you want and enjoying yourself, and perhaps making it clear that, the higher enjoyments, the higher pleasures are what matter. Because pleasure, with Moon's trine Mars, pleasure is important, and you need to get pleasure and satisfaction from everything that you're doing. And if you don't get pleasure and satisfaction from something, then you perhaps have to ask yourself what is wrong. But I don't think that's going to be an issue. I think it's perhaps a day when you really need to enjoy life, make the most of it, and take advantage of the fact that things are actually moving. Last few days they haven't been moving, but now I think they very much are moving. Sagittarius, you are in some respects still feeling the trine aspect between Venus and Jupiter. Venus is at 22 Libra, Jupiter is at 22 Gemini, and I talked about that aspect over the weekend. I think it's an extremely fortunate aspect, and of course Jupiter is your ruler. And so with Venus trine Jupiter, you can still feel that things are happening. I think that you're going to be luckier than average, and if things work, things should work. And if it's a toss-up, the toss-up is likely to go in your favour still, because Venus is trine Jupiter. But we are starting to see a changing emphasis, because the Moon is moving out of Aquarius into Pisces. And so with the Moon moving into Pisces, I think Sagittarius, that is going to have a certain grounding influence on you. You'll perhaps start to realise maybe what is important to you, what actually matters, and at the same time you possibly need grounding because you are perhaps developing some rather unusual perceptions. You're not quite sure what's happening, and you ask yourself questions, but are these questions really being answered? And one question doesn't seem to resolve anything, and perhaps you need to sort of get back to basics with the moon moving into Pisces. And perhaps there is not a great deal that actually has to be done, though when the moon moves into Pisces it does make a trine aspect to Mars. So moon trine Mars it's quite a constructive aspect, and it allows you to do good work, provided that work happens on your terms. It's not about doing things in another person's way. I don't think that would particularly work. That Venus trine Jupiter that I talked about, it is very sociable, but it's past its peak, and I think that there are people to have fun with perhaps, but it's increasingly not the point. Okay, if you're in Australia or New Zealand, perhaps that Venus trine Jupiter is going to be more of a feature of the day. Maybe you can be a little more relaxed. But if you're in Europe, the Americas, then I think that you perhaps need a little more of a serious, grounded approach. And there are certain things, Sagittarius, that I think that you can only do on your own, and so don't feel the pressure. Or when I say on your own, that could be like with your family, with people you know extremely well. Certainly not casual acquaintances. But I think a bit of seriousness over today and into tomorrow, I think, could actually be very, very good for you. Capricorn, we have a sign change. We have got the moon moving out of Aquarius into Pisces, and this movement is I would have said is fairly fortunate, because you've got Saturn's in Pisces. Saturn, your ruler, is in Pisces, and so the moon is now moving into the same sign as Saturn. Now, the conjunction between the moon and Saturn won't be until tomorrow, and I'll be talking about it then. But with the moon conjunct Saturn, I think, certainly other people might be feeling that it's not great, but I think from your perspective, it feels comfortable. You're comfortable with that energy. And as the moon moves into Pisces, I think you're better able to express yourself. You don't, I think, feel quite so self-conscious, and certain worries may be starting to drift away. Maybe recently you've been perhaps concerned about money or material things, or that's possible, but now things are changing, and you're better able to express who you are and what you want. And I think that you'll find that slowly some people are coming around to your way of thinking. You definitely had a way of thinking, and you were aware that not everyone agreed with you, and it seems that people are starting to agree with you. It's not like you've had to have some huge argument about it. It's just things change. You are perhaps ahead of a pack. You were the first person to make certain realizations, and it took other people some time to reach the conclusions that you may have reached months ago, even years ago. But anyway, they're reaching those conclusions, and I think that there is a certain sense of growing harmony as when the moon moves into Pisces, as the moon gets closer to Saturn. And also today we have the moon is making a trine aspect to Mars, and so that trine between the moon and Mars, I think from your perspective, it is quite helpful. It allows you to say what's on your mind, and it gives you a sense of purpose, and you're able to express yourself in a way that is compelling. People listen to you because you've definitely got something to say, and it's not all about being realistic and just focusing on what people have to do and the way the world is changing. You actually have a fundamental optimism to you. It's a grounded optimism, but it's still definitely a real optimism. And when people can just listen to how optimistic you are, once they've gone through the preambles, there are a lot of perhaps ifs and buts. If you do it like this, if you do it like that, if you don't do that, but fundamentally, things are okay, and that is a message you can definitely express, and it's also a message that you can express to yourself. So, you're a cautious Capricorn. You have your doubts. You know what can go wrong, but if you've been thinking about some plan or some idea or a way to move forward, you're now realizing that actually it can happen. It can happen. And, you're boosted by the fact that Venus is biquintile Saturn. Remember, Venus and Saturn are in mutual reception by exaltation, and this gives Saturn a great deal of strength. And so with Venus biquintile Saturn, I think that you do have, or you should have, a certain vision, a certain idea about how things can be, and it's actually a very optimistic vision. And okay, it's hard work, but it really can be. And this vision may relate to lots of different things. It could relate to your work or your business, but it could relate to other people. It could relate to relationships. It could just relate to your whole life in general. And so if you have that vision, and it's a realistic vision, it's not a fantasy vision, it can happen. And so Capricorn, take this vision and make it real, and try and do it sooner rather than later. because, Venus, this mutual reception between Venus and Saturn by exaltation, which I think is really helpful to you, is not going to last forever. At the end of a week, Venus moves into Scorpio, and that mutual reception breaks up. It's no longer active. So, it's Monday, start of a new week. I think the Venus biquintile Saturn should give you a clear idea about actually what can be achieved. So make sure you do your best to go out and make it happen. Aquarius. Aquarius, I was mentioning to Capricorn just now that Venus is biquintile Saturn. And okay, biquintile, that's sort of a pretty minor aspect, supposedly. It means that they're 144 degrees apart. But I regard that aspect as it being important, especially as Venus and Saturn are in mutual reception by exaltation. And that makes Saturn strong. It makes Venus strong. And then you've got the fact that Venus and Saturn are 144 degrees apart, which is 2/5 of the circle. And it's about what you can create. And so biquintiles are about having a vision, about having an idea. And then you have that idea, and then you turn that idea into reality. So Aquarius, you are someone who, at least on paper, is very inventive, and you're independent-minded, and you may not talk about all of your ideas, but you certainly have lots of ideas. So what are these ideas? And also, which ideas are actually achievable? Achievable, for example, over the next week. Okay, it may be that you can't achieve everything over the next week, but you can at least start work on it. And I think that is perhaps the challenge with this Venus biquintile Saturn, to actually make it happen. You take the inner vision and you start making it real, firstly in your immediate environment, and then you push it out further and further. So overall, Aquarius, I think that does put you in a very powerful position, and I'm really convinced that you can make things happen. And of course, it's going to be very important that you don't doubt yourself, and you shouldn't doubt, for example, other people. You might think that other people are not going to be cooperative, they're not going to play things your way. Well, do you know that? That's not necessarily the case. Perhaps you haven't tried, you haven't asked them, you haven't explained. And I think today you're going to be actually very good at explaining things. Now, on a more sort of mundane level, the moon is making a trine to Mars, certainly making a trine to Mars if you're in the Americas or Europe or Africa. The moon is making a trine to Mars, and that moon trine Mars is, I think, quite useful. It allows you to, I think, concentrate on important material things, and you can make real progress. So if there's something you want of a financial nature, or there's some object you really want to get hold of it, you can. So again, it's just important not to doubt yourself. You've got the higher ideas, the vision about what you want, but there's also the lower ideas about money and material stuff. That really shouldn't be a problem. And I think when it comes to money, you're going to have a good intuition about where the money is. And if something is hiding something from you financially, I think you'll just know instinctively. Now, if you are in Australia or New Zealand, Moon doesn't really move into Pisces until the end of the day, and for most of the day the Moon is going to be in Aquarius. And so perhaps the aspect you should be thinking about is Moon in Aquarius square Uranus. So this doesn't affect you if you're not in East Asia, Australia or New Zealand, but if you are Moon square Uranus, it could create a little bit of instability. And I suppose at home you have to be bit careful and dealing with members of your family. Someone's going to be stubborn, perhaps, and you're going to want your way, they're going to want their way, and somehow it's going to I don't know, it's not really a situation where there's going to be a compromise. Maybe it's just about mutual respect, but maybe someone should try to compromise. Maybe you can make a small compromise, nothing major, but just a little bit of a compromise could make things a lot better. But overall, Aquarius, wherever you are in the world, I think it's a day when you have a clear vision about what you want, and I think you actually have a chance to start really making things happen. So don't doubt yourself, and also don't doubt other people. If you explain things in the right way, I think they're going to be a lot more cooperative than you expect. Pisces. So Pisces, the moon is starting to move into your sign. When it moves into your sign kind of depends on your time zone. If you're in the Americas, the moon moves into Pisces very early in the morning. If you're in Europe, then it's very late it's sort of late in the morning towards lunchtime. Not lunchtime. It's sort of late morning, around noon. And then if you're in Australia or New Zealand, then it's going to be, I suppose, not until the early evening. So it kind of depends where you are to an extent, but the moon is moving into Pisces. And when the moon moves into Pisces, that is great because you're a Pisces. And when you've got the moon in your sign, you feel a sense that, everything is in order, that you're in the right place, that you don't have to go anywhere because you're comfortable. And the moon, when it moves into Pisces, it then starts to make a trine aspect to Mars in Cancer. So moon trine Mars is it's quite a nice aspect, and it's in water signs. Moon in Pisces, trine Mars in Cancer, and so you have a sense, I think, that of being in control, and that you can do things your way. And it's a very creative trine, actually. It allows you to exert energy in terms of the things that you want, the things that are important to you. And it does, to an extent, make you come over as being a fairly exciting person. And I think it's exciting. You're exciting also because you've got a really good imagination. I mean, your imagination is going to be great. You're going to have all sorts of thoughts, all sorts of dreams and ideas. Now, there is some risk that your imagination gets out of control, and your understanding of what's happening out there may not be perfect. Signals may get mixed. It's important not to jump to conclusions. Just because you imagine something doesn't mean it's true. But imagination isn't just about truth and falsehood. It's about just imagining pictures, words that are quite almost quite otherworldly. So if you are a Piscean artist over the next couple of days, I think you can do some great stuff, and your work will be of high quality. Even if you're not a Piscean artist, maybe you can aspire to being a Piscean artist. You don't have to be a professional artist. We've all got our inner artist to think about. So perhaps you can work on finding your inner artist and start to give your imagination some kind of structure. And there's a reminder there that the moon in Pisces is starting to make a conjunction to Saturn in Pisces. So we've got a moon-Saturn conjunction coming up. Now, some people might find the moon-Saturn conjunction rather difficult. Okay, so moon-Saturn conjunction is more a feature of tomorrow rather than today. But that moon conjunct Saturn is starting to make itself felt. And that I think it's a positive. I think it's about structuring your ideas. I really do think that is something that you can do. Now, as far as relationships are concerned, I think the picture looks good. Venus is still trine Jupiter. Okay, Venus was exactly trine Jupiter over the weekend, but you're still feeling it. And, Venus is the planet of love. It's a planet of other people. So if it's Venus trine Jupiter, I think that, you come over as being a pleasant, even charismatic person, perhaps an attractive person. I think people will like you. And I think with the moon trine Mars as well, you come over as being exciting and talented. So if you want to impress someone today, Pisces, then I think you've got every chance of being successful. And when you're with people who are on your wavelength, then I think things should run very well, and I think you can have fun. And I don't know if things like love and romance are important to you, and there's the opportunity. Then I think it's got Venus trine Jupiter, Moon's trine Mars. What more can you say? That kind of looks good, all things being equal. Of course, it's always all things being equal, but I'm trying to be positive in terms of what I'm saying. I'm trying to look at this chart from the potential here. I'm always very careful about talking about love and romance. I know astrologers like to talk about love and romance ad nauseum, but have to be so careful because there's so much focus for disappointment there. But astrologers are always under pressure to tell people that they need to, be positive about people's love lives. I have actually been criticised for being overly negative. I've been told that I've got to try to find the positives. You've got to give something to someone. You've got to give hope to someone. And I've been told that that I'd be more successful if I could be more positive. So I have had that as constructive criticism. But if love and romance are important, then today, well, certainly all things being equal, it's at the top of a range, maybe 4.5 stars out of 5. Anyway, that's it. That's all I'm going to say for the 12 signs. And I'm going to now look at today from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Monday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 54, the marrying maiden. So the marrying maiden is about, symbolically at least, a maiden who wants to get married. She's in a hurry to get married. She's keen to get married. It's about something we want to happen. We want to get attached to something. And perhaps we do whatever it takes, and we might be in a hurry. So perhaps there's a sense in which we want to join something, be part of something. It might not be about a relationship. It might be about an organization. It might be about a group of other people. But we do seem to be in a hurry here. And I suppose it might also be about someone else being in a hurry, someone being perhaps very keen on us, wanting to get our attention, wanting, symbolically to sort of come into our household. I think we've had this hexagram quite recently, so if this sounds familiar, I think we had it, I think a few days ago. Now, there are two moving lines here, and with these lines, there is a sense of, certainly the first moving line, there is a sense of humility here, that if we want to be part of something, we may have to accept a somewhat subordinate role. So, for example, if you are looking for a job or some kind of position, you may have to take a job where you feel that it's somewhat beneath your knowledge and your experience, and it might feel that it's somewhat humiliating. That might be one possibility with this, because it's a bottom line moving, and it does seem humiliating. But the I Ching is saying, well, maybe that's the right thing to do. In your own way, you're going to be respected. And in general, we have to perhaps be satisfied with perhaps having a lower status than expected in whatever we're doing. And so it's not a time, because remember, this is just a hexagram, this is just a reading for one day. So I think it's important not to be a prima donna here. Sometimes we have to accept the situation and perhaps say, well, it is for the best. But it is a difficult situation when we feel that we can't fully express who we are, when we feel we're not being fully respected. We deserve more from this because of our experience or our qualifications or our age, whatever. But the I Ching is suggesting that it's okay, that we would get respect in the end. Yet it is a frustrating situation, and we do get the third line moving. And with the third line moving, that may represent real dissatisfaction with the way things are. And we may feel a certain sense of humiliation, and we feel we need to fight back against it. We might feel we need to really assert ourselves and make it clear that we're a serious person who demand, we must be respected. If we were to do that, then it's going to backfire, and we would get nowhere, and we might lose whatever gains we've got. So I think humility is an important theme of this hexagram. Now, it may apply not to us, but to another person who is trying to work their way into our presence, into our household, into our group. And it may be about someone who starts off as being quite humble and understanding the situation, but as soon as they're allowed in, their dissatisfaction becomes clear, and then they start complaining, and then they start having ideas above their station. So that is another dimension to it. Now, this hexagram, the marrying maiden, it does move, and it moves to hexagram number 32, which is duration. The marrying maiden was about being uncomfortable, I think, being in a hurry, not being happy with the situation we're in, or it was in. There is a sort of instability there. And it moves to 32, which is duration, which is about persisting in something. We have to be clear who we are. Whatever our situation is, we ourselves have not changed, and we need to give duration to our personality, to who we are, what we are. And it's not about making huge changes. It's about taking what is good about us, our real abilities, the things that make us special, and then just continuing with them. And of course, being patient. Yeah, we may not get full recognition immediately, but if we keep going, then I think in the end, success and satisfaction are, I won't say guaranteed, but it does seem very likely. And that's it. I think it's a relatively simple I Ching. I don't think it's particularly dramatic. And just a reminder, it is just about today. So what I wanted to look at is Venus opposition Chiron. And Chiron is a comet with a very erratic, I won't say erratic orbit, but it's got a very elliptical orbit. And I've always been somewhat skeptical about Chiron, and I've sort of thought that maybe I don't really need to include Chiron in my chart reading. I had doubts about whether Chiron actually meant anything, but there were always two charts that bothered me, and I will be looking at these two charts. I've looked at these charts before, but there were always two charts that bothered me, and those were the charts of Aleister Crowley and Wilhelm Reich. And Aleister Crowley was this British magician, and Aleister Crowley and Wilhelm Reich was a psychotherapist whose ideas about about sex were particularly important to his work. Also with Crowley, of course, he had certainly had ideas about sex and sex magic, and these two charts really stood out because they both had Venus very closely opposition Chiron, and so I always thought there's got to be something in Chiron, because it's the Venus. I always knew that Venus opposition. I always knew about the Venus opposition Chiron in these two men's charts, and so I always thought that there's got to be something in it because it described them so well. So, what does Venus opposition Chiron actually mean? If you see Venus opposition Chiron in a chart. So, today we certainly have Venus opposition Chiron, and so that's why I wanted to focus on it. So, there is, there we've got today, we've got, Venus at 22 Libra, Chiron at 22 Aries. But in a general sense, what's Venus opposition Chiron about? So, if you take Chiron as being the wound, as being a wounded healer, then Venus opposition Chiron could be about some sense of rejection, feeling that you can't relate, that there is a wound regarding relationships, that you somehow always feel yourself to be a little bit alone and detached from the rest of the pack, and it is an issue. So that's certainly one way that Venus opposition Chiron can work. But there is a view of Chiron, which is, which was, the word was first used by I think it was Charles Cowell, who discovered Chiron. He said it is a maverick because he was looking at its orbit, but it was a maverick because of its orbit. But the maverick wants to do things differently, wants to relate in a way that is different, and perhaps has ideas about relating and sexuality that might be unusual. They might be groundbreaking, but in certain situations they could be problematic. I mean, they could verge on the criminal. It depends, doesn't it? So that's two ways in which Venus opposition Chiron could work. So there could be issues about relating, not just in a one-to-one sense, but perhaps relating to society at large. Is someone a person who society loves, or is it a person who society hates? And I think certain people with Venus opposition Chiron, society can really loathe them. Whether it's justified or not is another matter. And there can be a sense of persecution with Venus opposition Chiron, because you are different, because your approach is not the same as other people's approach. And I suppose that's Venus as society. Venus is trying to get on with people, trying to make good connections, but there's always that sense in which you may be persona non grata because you're too extreme, you're perhaps too much of a maverick, and that feeds back to the concept of a wound and about being rejected. So let's start by looking at people who have a pretty bad reputation, not just a reputation, bad reputation, who've done terrible things. So here is the horoscope of Genene Jones. I don't have her time of birth. So Genene Jones killed a lot of babies. I think she killed 60, I think, at least 60. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on her charts, not least because I don't know much about her and I don't have a time of birth. But Genene Jones had a Venus Chiron opposition, and so obviously she is a pariah because of her own actions. But the question is, why did she kill 60 babies, or probably more than 60 babies? And I think she's still in prison. And so Venus opposition Chiron may say something about that. And look at her Venus is square Saturn. So she's got, so Venus square Saturn is about, I suppose, some kind of childhood issues. You don't just kill babies just because the idea comes to you. It might represent some kind of wound, some kind of rejection, and somehow killing these children somehow is a way of responding to it. And so there is her Venus opposition Chiron, and you can see this in its most. Here you see Venus opposition Chiron in its most negative sense. I suppose you could say you do things which make you a pariah. You are separate from society, and you perhaps you hate society. That may be one possibility with Venus opposition Chiron, the ordinary society, people having children, going to hospitals, and that the ordinary flow of society is something you hate. Perhaps you resent the fact that you're not part of it, and so that could be how Venus opposition Chiron is working in her case. Now, another person who is a complete pariah is Jimmy Savile. So Jimmy Savile was a complete TV star in the UK. 60s, 70s, 80s. Everyone thought he was wonderful. He did a lot of work in charity, and he had a huge ego, and he was known for his trademark cigar, and he was most famous for he was famous for the Top of the Pops, which was one of his mainstream pop music programs in the 60s in the UK. Then he had this thing called Jim or Fix It, where children would write letters to him, asking for special requests, and he would see if he could make it. They might want to meet some celebrity, and he would fix it for them. And sometimes I suppose people with Jim or Fix It would write to him. Perhaps some child was very ill or terminally ill, and they had some last request to meet some celebrity, and he would fix it for them. So he was, all round nice guy. The only person, one person who didn't buy it was Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols. He knew immediately that I think in the 70s he said that this guy is really bad. He said it on radio, and of course the rumours were around about what he was doing in the 1970s, but no one accepted it. No one took it seriously. He was allowed to get away with it. And so what he did, he sexually abused mainly sort of young women, teenagers, and he did it in a sort of a serial way, and he did it with complete shameless impunity. And so he had Venus opposition Chiron. Now, he had a particular relationship to his mother. He was very fond of his mother, and when his mother died, he kept her room exactly as it was, and he would dry clean her clothes every year just to keep everything in order. And so there's certainly a mother issue. I don't have his time of birth, but he had Venus opposition Chiron. And so in this case, I suppose you could say that Chiron, as far as his Venus Chiron is concerned, it's a dissociate opposition. See, his Venus is at 2 degrees Scorpio, pretty difficult Venus in Scorpio, opposition Chiron. Now, Chiron is actually in Aries, but it's still 3 degrees apart, Venus opposition Chiron. So Venus opposition Chiron in this case is certainly saying something about his sexuality, and it may be something about his feelings of rejection, although he would go on, he was on record about talking about how he had a very I don't know about active sex life, but he would talk about all his sexual exploits. He was quite boastful about his sexual exploits, so he was saying there was no problem in that department. But there seems to be some kind of feeling of rejection, and that might explain his behavior. Or Chiron could be not just be okay, you think about maverick, but you can see the sort of the dark side of a maverick, doing what he liked and not really caring about the consequences. And his exploits, it didn't come out until after he was dead, so he never in this lifetime had to deal with the consequences of it. So that you could think, you might say, is perhaps Venus opposition Chiron, perhaps at its worst. And a couple of politicians with Venus opposition Chiron. Geert Wilders, the Dutch right-wing politician, very sceptical about the European Union, very concerned about immigration, and on record as being very critical of Islam. And you can see that his Venus is opposition Chiron. So how might that work? So you could say, if you've got Venus opposition Chiron, if Chiron is a maverick, you're not going to follow the mainstream. You're going to perhaps ask questions that other people don't want to ask. And you might seem, somewhat unusual. I think he has his, I think they call it something like Mr. Peroxide. He likes to peroxide his hair, and maybe, I don't know, I'm not saying that's anything to do with Venus opposition Chiron, but he actually also has Sun opposition his Chiron as well, so he's a Sun-Venus conjunction opposition Chiron, and so he is at odds perhaps with the rest of Dutch society, but of course a lot of people vote for him. I suppose you could say he's at odds with mainstream Dutch society, but he wants to do things differently. Now, I suppose this depends on what your view of Geert Wilders is. Obviously, if you're an opponent of Geert Wilders and you don't like what he's doing, then you could say, well, that's just him being weird and not being helpful. If you're a supporter of Geert Wilders, you'd perhaps see Venus opposition Chiron as him being the maverick, him perhaps having the courage to say what other people can't say. And I think that's helped by the fact that he's got Sun opposition Chiron. Sun opposition Chiron wants to make it clear, and he doesn't care about the consequences. So there's Geert Wilders. I don't have a time of birth, so there's sort of limits to what I can say there. And Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris has Venus opposition Chiron. So she has Chiron at 14-15 Pisces and Venus at 15 Virgo. So it's actually quite a close opposition between, sorry, no, that's Pluto. She's got Venus, 3 degrees out. So her Venus is actually conjunct Pluto. It's opposition Chiron. From a political point of view, she is not a maverick. She kind of, not really. She represents a wing of the Democrat Party. She has been politically successful because of, just by doing what she had to do, getting involved in a machine. So that doesn't seem to be how Venus opposition Chiron is working. I would suggest that Venus opposition Chiron does say something about perhaps her approach to relationships. We know that her relationship with, I think, a San Francisco politician, her romantic relationship with a San Francisco politician played a big role at the beginning of her political career. And that might be Venus opposition Chiron, perhaps not perhaps seeing relationships in the normal way, perhaps seeing relationships maybe in quite a transactional way and perhaps being a bit different about it. It might, I suppose at the time, when she was having a relationship with someone who was decades older than her, that must have seemed a bit strange. What is Kamala doing? And that might be her, the maverick, Chiron, Venus opposition Chiron, and that might be how it was working. And so, perhaps you know more about her pattern of relationships than me, but I would have said that might be the sense in which with her about how Venus opposition Chiron is functioning. sort of going back to people of a sort of with a criminal history. Mohamed Atta, one of the people involved in 9/11. I understand that that's a controversial point. We don't know quite who was involved in 9/11, but if you take the mainstream view, it was Al-Qaeda, and Mohamed Atta was an Al-Qaeda operative, and he led the team which created 9/11, and he has Venus opposition Chiron. It's not an exact Venus opposition Chiron, but Venus in Virgo opposition Chiron in Aries. I mean, it's, I think, about 3 or 4 degrees orb. And so Venus opposition Chiron, I think that we would see perhaps this as being a certain sense of estrangement here. Okay, you could say it as that he's a maverick. I think he did like to do things a little bit differently. I mean, he was an architecture student, and as an architecture student, I think he perhaps should have stayed as an architecture student rather than got involved in Al-Qaeda. He had particular views about architecture. He opposed certain modern aspects of architecture, particularly in terms of buildings in Cairo. He didn't like modern buildings. He wanted a sort of more traditional approach, and perhaps he wasn't being a conformist there. So that might be potentially quite a useful way of using Venus opposition Chiron. But he studied in the West, I think in Germany, and he was always a bit different, a bit estranged, and I think that he found dealing with Western women a problem. I think there was a story that he wouldn't, when he got his diploma, he wouldn't. When there was a woman handing out the diploma, he wouldn't shake her hand. So that's perhaps the issue about Venus opposition Chiron. And so if you're Al-Qaeda recruiting people, you want to have people who perhaps are socially a bit detached, and I think that very much seems to be the case with him. Notice that Mohamed Atta doesn't have any planets in water signs. There's nothing wrong with having no planets in water signs, but if you've got no planets in water signs and you've got Venus opposition Chiron, you might just be a little detached from society, and that could make you vulnerable. And in Hindu astrology, he's also got Kamadruma yoga, which is when the moon is isolated. When there are no traditional. We don't count Neptune because that is a discovered planet. So his moon is isolated. That means he is quite a lonely, isolated figure, and perhaps Venus opposition Chiron is working rather like Kamadruma yoga. And he's got both, Venus opposition Chiron, the isolated moon, and so he is apart from society, and he would be the perfect person for Al-Qaeda to recruit. Now I want to consider Wilhelm Reich and Aleister Crowley. So with Wilhelm Reich, I've looked at Wilhelm Reich's chart a couple of times, and sure, with Wilhelm Reich, one aspect was his ideas about sexuality. He was very traditional Freudian. He was a psychotherapist, he was a doctor, he was a psychoanalyst, and originally he was a student of Freud, and he broke from Freud because what was happening was, as I understand it, Freud had these ideas which were perhaps at odds with European society, I don't know, in the run-up to the First World War. And that Freud sort of moderated some of his ideas to make them more palatable, and particularly those relating to sexuality. And Wilhelm Reich was not into that. He was an original Freudian, and he put a central emphasis on sexuality. It was a major part of his work, and as he progressed through life, it became more and more intense. And I think in the end, he hypothesized this thing called the orgone energy, and orgone energy permeated everything, and it was you needed to energy had to flow, and I suppose also, of course, sexual repression, as far as he was concerned, sexual repression led to things like fascism and communism, and he wrote this book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism, in which he saw Nazi Germany as kind of using the mother archetype to control, for example, members of a Hitler Youth. You can control people by twisting their parental axis and making the parent, the state, like the fatherland, the motherland. I mean, it's a really good book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, and it's certainly an interesting theory. But Venus opposition Chiron, okay, it's about him having unusual ideas about sex, giving sex this central role in his work as a psychoanalyst. But it's also about rejection and being wounded and being persecuted. And Wilhelm Reich was persecuted throughout his life. He was persecuted by everyone. He was persecuted by the communists. So he did become a communist in the 1930s. At a time he was associated with the communists. I think he joined the Communist Party. But then at a certain stage his ideas fell foul of the Communist Party, and then he was thrown out of the Communist Party. So he fell out with them. So that's his first group he had a problem with. Then, of course, the Nazis started coming to power. So he was Jewish, and so he was at risk of persecution. So, quite sensibly, he left Nazi Germany and went to America, the land of the free. But the persecution didn't stop there, because he created this machine, because he was getting really into this orgone energy, and he had created this, I think it was called an orgone generator or something like that. And he had these theories about materials, and you have a metal-lined box, and he was claiming that it could cure disease, it could cure cancer, cure leukemia, and he would suggest these kind of things. And he was also thinking that this machine could be used to create rain. In fact, I think Kate Bush did a song about him called Cloudbuster. So that did a short video of it with I think Donald Sutherland played Wilhelm Reich in this short video she made. So he was into this, and of course what happened is he fell foul of the Food and Drug Administration, because he was trying to sell a medical product which had no evidence that it actually worked. And of course the Federal Drug Administration told Wilhelm Reich that he should stop doing what he was doing, and he refused, and he ended up in prison, and he died in prison. So he was persecuted by the communists, by the Nazis, and indeed by the US. So he was persecuted by everyone. And so he has an exact Venus opposition Chiron. So you can see the wounds of persecution, of rejection, and of course his ideas about sexuality. And he had very strong and controversial ideas about the central place of sex, and his in terms of psychoanalysis, sexuality was pretty much everything as far as I understand it. And finally, Aleister Crowley, magician. I think I looked at his chart very recently, and he had Venus opposition Saturn, and Venus opposition Chiron, very close Venus opposition Chiron, and I think it really works. I mean, this is really very much about him. He enjoyed being different, being estranged from society. I mean, he did it quite deliberately. I mean, he had this monastery in Sicily, in Cefalu, where he bought it, and he had his sort of in the early 20s, and I think he deliberately spread rumours that he was sacrificing babies because he liked the notoriety. I don't think he wasn't. I'm pretty sure he wasn't, but he just loved the notoriety, and he liked to be a pariah. I mean, during the First World War, he went to New York and started supporting Germany. Now, there is a theory that he was actually working as an agent, as an agent provocateur, so, or as trying to bring German sympathizers out of the woodwork. So there is that theory, but it didn't help his reputation, the fact that he was supporting Germany during the First World War, which would be fairly treasonable. And the tabloid press in the 20s was always talking about stories about him and his outrageous behavior, and he reveled in it. And his reputation was terrible in the mountaineering. He was an expert mountaineer, but there was an instance where there was a big disaster and a lot of people were killed and on an expedition. He did nothing. He just let them die. He didn't do anything to help. He took the view there was nothing he could do. But he was certainly a maverick, and absolutely no doubt about that at all. Estranged from society, or at least from some aspects of society. But as with Wilhelm Reich, there were a group of people who absolutely adored him. And Wilhelm Reich and Aleister Crowley remain today iconic figures. A lot of people think they are absolutely great. And of course, with Aleister Crowley, like Wilhelm Reich, he had ideas about sexuality. His sexuality was central to him, and he described himself as being pansexual. Sex was a very important part of his magic, sex magic, in the same way that sex was a very important part of Wilhelm Reich's psychoanalysis. So with Aleister Crowley, I think that Venus opposition Chiron does work extremely well, and as I think it also works extremely well in the case of Wilhelm Reich. Now, I have looked at extreme charts. I always have to say this when I look at one particular planetary aspect. It's a relatively small sample. It's a very small sample, actually. And it is an extreme example, but it just perhaps gives us some themes with Venus opposition Chiron, that perhaps if we can bring them down to earth, we can perhaps use them when interpreting charts. So that's it with Venus opposition Chiron. I hope you found this video useful. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you are not subscribed and you enjoyed this video, I would be really, really grateful if you were to subscribe. And if you want to buy me a coffee, there is a link in the description. So thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.